Hello and welcome back to Saints of the Week here at The Things That Don't Change. Today is the 16th Sunday in Ordinary Time. And got a lot of saints this week. A very, very packed week of very holy people. So we will waste no time in getting straight down to it. The first saint that we have to talk about today is Saint Lawrence of Brindisi. So Saint Lawrence was born on the 26th of July in the year 1559 in the town of Brindisi, which is in southern Italy. At his birth, he was actually not given the name Lawrence. He was given the name Julio Cesare, or Julius Caesar. He was born to two very devout parents, and from a very early age, he showed a great desire for the religious vocation. He was educated by the conventuals of Brindisi. This was a subset of the Capuchin order. And by the age of 6, very, very early on, he showed promise in public speaking and oratory. And it was said that as a child, he would always be the one who they kind of went to give sermons on the infant Jesus during the Christmas festivals every year. During the time when he was a child, his parents both passed away, which found him actually moving to Venice to live with an uncle of his. And it was this uncle who helped instruct him and also got him enrolled at the College of St. Mark in Venice. And it was during this time in Venice when he officially entered the Capuchin order. And it was also during this time that Julio took the name of Lawrence. At age of 23, he completed his studies of philosophy and theology at the University of Padua, and was officially ordained a priest. He was very skilled in languages, so he was able to kind of study the Bible in the original languages, and due to this knowledge, especially very deep knowledge of the Hebrew language, he was actually asked by Pope Clement VIII to kind of be one of the primary preachers around Italy to the Jews, right? So there's of course many Jewish communities in Italy around this time. And Lawrence was, tasked with ministering to them and kind of preaching to them, trying to evangelize them, to the truth of the Christian faith that, Christ was the Messiah. So over the next couple of years, he went through with this work, and a lot of the Jews, they were very taken aback by his knowledge of Hebrew, and they thought that, because of how well he knew Hebrew, he actually had been a Jew himself and had converted to Catholicism. Of course, he wasn't. He was always raised a Gentile. It was due to this example of his that many Jews were baptized, kind of by him in this time into the Christian faith. So as the years went on, and his legend kind of started to rise up as to how great of a speaker and an evangelist he was commissioned to establish some new Capuchin houses in Germany and Austria, right? So this is the mid to late 16th century. So the Reformation is kind of at its fever pitch right now. A lot of Germany is kind of falling to the different Protestant groups. The Capuchins kind of want more of a presence there to kind of help evangelize. So Lawrence was kind of tasked with being the primary one to set these houses up. So when he got to Germany and Austria, however, and kind of stayed at some of the existing Capuchin houses in Vienna, Prague, Graz, he was kind of very dismayed at the great heresies and kind of the lax standards of these monasteries. During his time, he kind of worked to kind of turn those around and kind of reform those a bit. He became the vicar general of the Capuchins in 1602, so kind of the head honcho of the order. And, it was during this time, with of course, his expertise in administrative work up until this point, it was during this time where he did a tour of all the different provinces of the order and kind of was received well. They all, revered him and his holy reputation that preceded him. And he spent, the next couple of years just trying to stabilize the administration of the order. He was known for his great wisdom, firmness, and also just a fatherly tenderness for the Capuchins under his care. He did a lot of work in kind of helping to reform the order and some of the abuses he saw, especially in places like Germany and Austria. So in 1605, so this is about 3 years, he served in this position. His term ended, and he did not want to go for another term. He agreed to kind of let himself retire. After this, he was sent to Germany again by the Pope to just evangelize in general to Catholics and the Protestants, again, height of the Reformation right now. And he ended up winning many new converts and also converting many who had fallen away. He was known for his great interior holiness. He was very contemplative. He would commonly fall into ecstasy during celebration of the Mass. He had a great Marian devotion, both to the Rosary and just also to Mary, more in general. He was just also known to kind of break into Marian hymns at random points as he went around. He retired in the year 1618 to the monastery of Caserta in southern Italy, and he'd only just kind of gotten into his retirement when he was immediately brought out of it again by men who men who were high up in the government of the Kingdom of Naples. Of course, at this time, the Kingdom of Naples was a subsidiary of the Spanish crown. So the King of Spain also was King of Naples. And the men of the court were kind of upset with the viceroy, kind of the representative of the king who kind of oversaw Naples in the absence of the king. They were kind of upset with this viceroy who just wasn't really being very good in his position. So they wanted Lawrence, knowing his great virtue, to go to King Philip II, or sorry, King Philip III in Spain, kind of intercede, for the, intercede for the Neapolitan people. So St. Lawrence agreed to this, and he sailed from Genoa across to Spain itself. He did carry out the mission successfully, sent the message to the king. The king took care of what he needed to take care of. However, the journey at this advanced stage is kind of really tired out St. Lawrence, and he was actually unable to end up traveling home. And he eventually ended up in Lisbon, where he died the next year on the 22nd of July in the year 1619. And actually, it's said that he predicted his own death. Before he set out on this journey, he foresaw that he would die before he came back to Naples. So he was buried at the cemetery of the Poor Clares of Villafranca in Portugal. And in the year 1783, he was beatified by Pope Pius VI and was finally canonized in the year 1881 by Pope Leo XIII. And he is known as one of the doctors of the Franciscan order. The Capuchins are kind of a subset of the Franciscans. So although he's a Capuchin, he's also a Franciscan more broadly. So he's seen as one of the doctors of the Franciscan order, along with St. Anthony of Padua, who we discussed a couple weeks ago, St. Bonaventure, who we discussed very recently, and then also Blessed John Duns Scotus. And his feast day is on July the 21st. So the next saint that we have, biblical saint, is Saint Mary Magdalene. So Saint Mary Magdalene, of course, we know from the Gospels, she was born sometime in the 1st century AD. She was one of the women who followed Jesus on his public ministry. It's mentioned in several points that there were kind of a group of women who followed Jesus around, and they provided for the ministry kind of out of their means. This is the way St. Luke puts it. So, there's some debate about exactly what her position was. Traditionally, she's been held that she was a prostitute who Jesus cast 7 demons from. We know that Jesus did cast 7 demons from her, but the prostitute bit is kind of more of an inference that kind of rose over time. So some people argue that, say that maybe she was just a rich woman of some means, maybe a widow. But whatever her past was, scripture is silent on the specifics of that, but whatever it was, we do know that Jesus, did cast 7 demons out from her. Luke chapter 8 tells us about this. And then after that, she followed Jesus and his ministry. So she was one of the women present for the crucifixion, and also was one of the ones who went on the beginning of Sunday to anoint his body, right? So Jesus died on Friday. Saturday was the Sabbath, so no one, was allowed to do any work. So it wasn't until Sunday that the women were actually able to go and anoint his body, for a more proper burial. However, when they showed up there and they did not find the body, they started to get kind of freaked out, not knowing what happened. And it's actually Mary Magdalene who Christ first appeared to and told her to bring the good news of his resurrection to the apostles, to the 12 or the 11 at this point. So it's because of this she's traditionally known as the apostle to the apostles, kind of as the one to bring the message of the resurrection to the 11, who then of course went out to preach that message to the world. So after the gospel, we're not really sure what happened to her. However, some traditions hold that she eventually came to southern France, where she ended up dying. So again, not a whole lot we know. A lot of the biblical saints are a bit tricky because we only know what's mentioned in the Gospels or in the writings or stuff like that, and a lot of them there isn't a whole lot, So we're kind of relying more on tradition, that has kind of arisen. But either way, these are the people who were there for the very foundation of Christianity. Mary Magdalene, being the apostle to the apostles, was a very vital member kind of Jesus' ministry around this time. And her feast day is on the July the 22nd. So the next saint that we have is Saint Bridget of Sweden. So St. Bridget was born in the year 1304 in Uppland, Sweden, which is kind of a province that's kind of just north of Stockholm, which is the capital of Sweden. So she was born to a wealthy family. Her father was a knight and a governor kind of that territory. And it was during her time as a child, sometime, between ages like 7 and 10, that she had her first vision. She was, St. Bridget was known for her visions. The first one she had was when she was a child, and she had a vision of the crucified Christ, Christ up on the cross. And she asked him, who had done that to him, who had put him up there, to which he replied, all those who have despised my love. So it's kind of this experience that kind of really, jump-started her great sanctity and her great, mission of holiness, over the course of her life. She was actually married at the age of 13, so very young. This was, kind of par for the course in this time in history. She was married to a young nobleman, young, Swedish nobleman by the name of Ulf Gudmarsson. So, he was part of a noble family in the Kingdom of Sweden. Eventually this couple, as they were together for years, they eventually ended up having 8 children in total, most of which or all survived infancy, depending on what sources you read. One of her daughters actually became a saint in her own right. Saint Catherine of Sweden was the daughter of Saint Bridget. But as a family, they tried to live a holy life. Saint Bridget became known, during this time for her great charity, especially towards unwed mothers and children. As her husband was a nobleman, and she was part of a noble family, they did spend a lot of time in the court of the King of Sweden. So, when King Magnus Eriksson, who was the king around this time, married Blanche of Namur, who was a princess from one of the German states, they got married, and of course, that she comes from Germany, so she doesn't know the Swedish language or any of the culture. So Bridget was actually the one who was chosen to be her lady in waiting to kind of help, coach her and kind of teach her the ways, the language and the ways of the Swedish court. So, during this time, Bridget became very friendly with the king and his wife. Her husband too. The king and his wife weren't quite as devout in their religion, but of course Bridget tried to evangelize to them as she could. After some years, Bridget and her husband Ulf, they made a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, which is the great pilgrimage site, where you have the Camino that people still travel today, that goes from southern France all the way down to the Santiago de Compostela in Spain, which is held to be the burial place of Saint James and his remains. So it was during their way home from this pilgrimage that Ulf became seriously ill. They had to stop, and it seemed like he might die. However, a bishop actually appeared to them and said that Ulf would recover, and that Bridget herself, God had great things for her still to do. So this suspicious, this strange bishop ends up revealing himself kind of as Saint Denis. So Saint Denis, the great 4th century bishop and martyr of Paris, one of the patrons of France. It was his apparition that kind of appeared to them and foretold that Ulf would recover, and also that Bridget would kind of go on to a great holy life. So Ulf did recover from this and continued to work as a governor for many years, kind of in the province where they lived back in Sweden, until the year 1344 when he again became ill, and this time while he was kind of convalescing with some monks at Alvastra in Sweden, he ended up dying and then was buried there. Bridget was very grieved by this. She loved her husband very much. And she spent many long hours praying at his grave, just praying, for his soul, and also praying to the Lord just to kind of give her guidance going forward. Her children were grown by this point, had kind of gone off to their own lives. So trying to figure out where her place was something that she was really praying for discernment. She was only 41 at this time, so there's still many years left that she had to give. So it was during this time that, God spoke to her and called her to kind of pursue the religious path, path of a religious sister. And this kind of coincided with the desire that Bridget had to start a order, kind of catering towards women. So God gave her a vision, where he kind of laid out very specific rules for the order itself and very specific parameters to kind of see, to kind of carry out. He said that he showed her where the church was to be built for this monastery. He gave direction as to the clothing that these nuns should wear and also the prayers that should be part of the rule. He gave the number of nuns, which was going to be about 60 to start off with. He also said specifically who were the priests who were to become the chaplains, and then laid out 13 priests, 4 deacons, and 8 lay brothers who would serve this community. Also said that the community was to be ruled by an abbess who was to be like the Blessed Virgin Mary in the upper room, kind of as that voice amongst apostles and successors of apostles. So King Magnus, who of course Bridget was friends with the king and the queen, King Magnus donated one of his palaces for the order to live in, and she had just begun organizing the order when she was actually called away. God appeared to her again very early on in this process and said that he wanted her to go to Rome and tirelessly work until the Pope returned from France. This was during the period of the Avignon papacy, which we discussed a couple months back. When the Pope had been living in Avignon, France for a long time, and there was a lot of disagreement because he was still Bishop of Rome, but he wasn't living in Rome, and the head of the church should be in Rome because that's where he's bishop. So, there were a lot of saints, and Catherine of Siena was involved in kind of trying to get the Pope to come back. So St. Bridget was called by God to travel to Rome and help see this work done. So, so she left Sweden in 1349 and arrived at Rome in the year 1350, so the next year. And she worked tirelessly for reform in the church. This Avignon papacy was a very corrupt period. There's a lot of abuses that were going on. So, she just worked as hard as she could to reform the church, to get the Pope to come back. She met with a lot of failure in this effort. She didn't really have a whole lot of success. There was a lot of opposition, and the Pope didn't actually end up coming back to Rome until after her time. She never actually ended up getting to return to Sweden and take care of her order. It was kind of taken care of in her absence, but the rest of her life was kind of devoted to Rome as best she could. So she died on the 23rd of July in the year 1373 in Rome, and was canonized in the year 1391 by Pope Boniface IX. And then in the year 1999, she was made co-patroness of Europe by Pope St. John Paul II. And her feast day is on the day that she passed away, on July the 23rd. So the next saint that we have is Saint Charbel Makhulf. Saint Charbel was born on the 8th of May in the year 1828 in Beka Kafra, in what was then known as the Emirate of Mount Lebanon. Today would be present-day Lebanon. He was baptized with the name Yusuf Antun Makhulf, and he was a Maronite Catholic. So, of course, that's one of the Eastern Catholic churches, which is in full communion with Rome, of the Maronite rite. So his father was a simple mule driver, very man of humble means, who died a couple of years after Yusuf was born in the year 1831. And, his mother was a woman named Bridget, who, of course, was now widowed after the death of his father. So she ended up remarrying to a man who eventually became a priest, right? This is the Maronite rite. So it's one of the Eastern rites where you're allowed to, even if you're married, you're allowed to then continue to become a priest in your own right. So Yusuf was brought up in a very pious home, of course, the son of a priest, stepson of a priest, I suppose. And from a very early age, he was drawn to the lives of the saints and inspired by two of his uncles who were actually, hermits, kind of lived kind of that hermit lifestyle. So as a child, he would often serve as a shepherd. And it was commonly when he was out kind of tending to the flock that he would spend time at a grotto that was nearby his home, which inside the grotto, there was an icon of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And he would just spend, large portions of his day just kind of praying to the Blessed Virgin, praying at this grotto. In the year 1851, he left his family to become a monk of the Lebanese Maronite order, also known as the Baladites. And he studied at the monastery of Our Lady of Makhulf, which is kind of one of the main monasteries of this order. Eventually, he was transferred to another monastery called the Monastery of Saint Maron in Anaya, which is near Beirut in Lebanon. He took the habit and the religious name Charbel, Charbel being a 2nd century martyr from Antioch, who he respected. So he took the name Charbel and also took the habit, and then eventually made his final profession as a Baladite in 1853. So he studied philosophy and theology at the monastery of Saint Cyprian and Justina in Kefifan. And it was during this time that one of his teachers, kind of during his studies, was a man named Nimatullah Kassab, who actually became a saint in his own right. So Saint Nimatullah being another saint of the Maronite Church. In the year 1859, Charbel was ordained to the priesthood and then sent to the monastery of Saint Maron kind of full time, where he lived a life of just very strict austerity. And it was in 1875 that he got permission from the abbot of the monastery to become a hermit, right? So kind of live in a very specific home for hermits where he was, kind of more isolated and kind of was able to devote a large part of his time just to straight prayer. Of course, that's something his uncles both were, and taking their example, then kind of lived out the rest of his life as a hermit. Charbel died on the 24th of December, 1898, so on Christmas Eve. And it was reported that during a fierce snowstorm that was kind of blowing through during this Christmas, they needed to move his body from the hermitage where he lived to the kind of the main church itself. But the storm was just awful, and it was kind of hard to see and kind of trudge through this blizzard. But it said that the storm actually miraculously cleared up to allow the pallbearers to kind of move his body to the church. His body was declared incorrupt several times. It didn't continue to be incorrupt, actually. In the year 1976, when they checked it, it looks like it had started to decompose. However, it was checked several times from the time that he died in 1898 until 1976. And like 5 or 6 times, the body still looked just as if he had still been living. So, of course, that was seen as a great miracle. People were always just very fascinated by his life, even those who didn't know about him until afterwards. Just, in a world that was kind of becoming very increasingly commercialized and, just very wealth oriented as the 20th century started. This great saint who lived this life of extreme poverty and just without any attachments to the world was just somebody that a lot of people looked up to. He was beatified in 1965 by Pope St. Paul VI, and then canonized in 1977, also by Pope St. Paul VI. And his feast day is on July the 24th. So the next saint that we have is St. James the Apostle. So, St. James, this is St. James, son of Zebedee. There's quite a few Jameses in Scripture, depending on who you connect with what. You have James the Greater, Apostle James the Greater, which would be this St. James, James the Lesser, who was the other St. James, who was also an apostle, and then also James, who wrote the book of James, which is seen as a completely different James from those two. So the saint that we're talking about here is St. James the Apostle, son of Zebedee, so the brother of St. John the Evangelist, of course, hailing from Galilee. He worked as a fisherman, just like brothers Andrew and Simon. He was chosen along with Andrew and Simon to become one of Jesus' disciples. Of course, that great miracle of catching of all the fish that, Jesus telling St. Peter to throw the net over. And upon doing this, not expecting to find anything, the nets were just bursting with fish. St. James traveled with Jesus and kind of became one of his kind of inner group of disciples, kind of the big three, who were kind of brought aside in several different instances to witness certain miracles. So the other ones who kind of also were kind of privileged in this way were his brother John, the son of Zebedee, John the Evangelist, and then also Simon Peter, right? So you had instances like the Transfiguration, where they were brought up the mountain. He also had the raising of Jairus' daughter, where it was the three of them who witnessed that, and Jesus told them not to tell anybody just yet. And then also the Garden of Gethsemane. They're the ones who were asked to kind of come in a little farther into the garden and wait 1 hour, with Jesus. So St. James, along with St. John, were the ones who asked for seats of honor in the kingdom at Jesus' right or left. They asked this, and also their mother, asked this, for them. And of course, this is when Jesus kind of foretold how they would die. And then this, kind of started a bit of a debate amongst the apostles as to who was the greatest. And then Jesus, of course, responds with the famous line that the greatest among them will be as the least, right? It will be as the servant. So St. James was the first of the apostles to be martyred. And this happened in the book of Acts of the Apostles. We see Herod has James killed, has him beheaded. And, this is also around when Peter is arrested and put in prison, of course, later to be released by an angel. St. James is known as St. James the Greater to differentiate him from the other Apostle James, who was known as St. James the Lesser. The way of St. James, which, we talked about with St. Bridget, the great, Santiago de Compostela Church, and then the Camino, which you can walk to get there. That pilgrimage is in honor of St. James himself. That's a popular pilgrimage, and it's said that his relics are kept at that church. So that's kind of all we have on St. James, and his feast day is on July the 25th. Now, the final two saints we have today are probably some of the saints with the least information about them in all of kind of the canons, but they have a very important role to play, and that's Saints Joachim and Anne. So Saint Joachim and Anne are held to be the mothers of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and we don't know their names from Scripture. They're not in Scripture, not even mentioned in Scripture. Obviously, Mary had parents, right? And we don't really know anything about Mary's family other than the fact that Elizabeth was her cousin. And, possibly one of the other Marys might have been a relative of hers. But, we don't know anything about her parents from Scripture itself. Most of the information that we do have about Saints Joachim and Anne actually come from what's known as the Gospel of James, also known as the Proto-Evangelium of James. Now, this is an apocryphal work, not one of the Gnostic ones. Like the Gnostic ones are the ones that we definitely know, aren't, don't have very reliable information in them. They're written very far later. The Proto-Evangelium is actually a very early work comparatively, not as early as the Gospels, of course, which are written, first century, 20 years or so, 20 to 30 years after the crucifixion. So those are like primary sources. But the Proto-Evangelium was written sometime in the 2nd century, so a little later. Definitely wasn't written by any of the Apostle Jameses because they were long dead by this point. But the Proto-Evangelium is a very important work of early Christian history in that it shows some of the traditions and stories that were circulating in the very earliest days about the different figures, right? So the Proto-Evangelium basically describes what happened before the Nativity. So it opens with a man named Joachim, a man who's described as exceedingly rich, a very wealthy man, and then also his wife Anna, or Anne, who was a very holy woman, but was barren. She didn't have any children. They weren't able to conceive a child, and of course, in this culture that they were kind of looked down upon. They felt looked down upon because of that. So in a very Hannah way, Hannah from the book of Samuel, who wasn't able to get a child and prayed to God, and then eventually promised God that the first child that she had would be given to the Lord. Of course, the Lord blessed her with the prophet Samuel, who then went to live in the temple and became the great prophet Samuel. Very much like that. The Proto-Evangelium says that Mary's mother Anna, kind of did this. She promised that her first child she would dedicate to the Lord. So Anna's prayer was granted, and she eventually conceived, and the child that she had was Mary. And it's said that from a very early age, Joachim and Anna gave Mary to the temple to kind of be a virgin of the temple. So she grew up her days there, at least until the age of 12. When they decided they need to find a guardian to kind of watch over her. Of course, she had been dedicated as a virgin. This is another very early source for why we think she was a perpetual virgin. Why that's a dogma of the church. And of course during this time that Joseph, who in this reckoning was an old widower, who had children of his own and was advanced in years, but his wife had passed away, was kind of tasked with being kind of her guardian, her husband, in the sense that he was to watch over her and kind of keep her. Just kind of keep her protected as somebody dedicated for the Lord. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of going a bit far afield. The Proto-Evangelium goes on to kind of talk about the conception of Jesus, how the angel came to Mary, and kind of a little more about the issues that Joseph ran into and the struggles that he had, not knowing how, where this child came from, and trusting in the Lord, and of course having that great dream and all the stuff that we know from other sources up until the birth of Jesus. So when it comes to Joachim and Anna, though, we don't know too much else about them. We don't officially know their names other than from this Proto-Evangelium, and we don't know anything else about their lives besides what's recorded here. But of course, being the mother and father of the Blessed Virgin Mary, whatever whatever else about their life that's just kind of goes to show goes to show, I guess, almost a type of sorts or a prefiguration of sorts of the Holy Family themselves, and their feast days are on July the 26th. So that's all we have for today. Like I said, a lot of saints, a lot of good ones, and I hope you all have a blessed week. And I'll see you again next week for our next edition of Saints of the Week. God bless.